Hi there, this will be the last lecture um, on the English School, on international society, and with particular what we'll look at this time, what we'll try and see is how does an international society maintain order in the world. Remember, I think back to the first lecture where we said like international society is one of the ways of keeping order in the world. And it's still a little bit mysterious to me, but we'll go through what I read in Hedley Bull's book and see what we're left with. I don't know if maybe it's more simple than I'm making out, but we'll have a look and we'll see what sort of conclusions we might come to. Okay. How is order maintained in world politics? I mean, I think the distinguishing feature of Hedley Bull and the English school more widely is that, that this can even be a question, right? It's a significant question when we think about world politics and realism. World politics is sort of like the lack of order, and it's how sort of how the states deal with that, right? With the danger that comes from that lack of order, right? From the anarchy, how the states react to that, right? And it's that they try and amass power, right, to be able to survive. So you can see like that's a big movement away from that is in English school, where we're saying, how does world politics, how is order maintained in world politics? Which is, I think it's the difference is stark if we compare it with realism. If we compare it with liberalism, it's slightly less stark, but I think it's still there. And I think the way it goes is something like this. Liberals are sort of optimistic realists in some ways. It's like, well, yes, there's anarchy, and yes, there's power, but it's not just military power. It's not just sort of force. It's not just the use of force. States can use other types of power, and states can, in fact, because it's in their interest to do so, they can kind of cooperate at times. This the English school's probably like assuming at the beginning, right? Look, order is kept in world politics, and there's some sort of agreement. It's not completely anarchic. The system's not anarchic. It's governed. So if we remember, anarchy means like a lack of government, but it's governed by the states in the English school. Okay, who are agreeing on certain principles and who have sort of some common goals and common aims. That's not usually the case. Well, that's never the case, I don't think, in realism, and it's usually not the case in liberalism as well, I think. So anyway, so how is order maintained? That question itself is quite English school. And so I'm going to come at this in two ways, because this is what Hedley Bull does, and so I'm going to follow him because he knows the best what the English school is, because he invented it. But this is where he starts, the maintenance of order in social life. He says, right, so in social life, individuals have common interests in the elementary goals of social life. They want to restrict violence, they want to respect agreements, and they want to stabilize possession. And they're driven by fear, rational calculation that limitations are reciprocal. Hobbes says this as well, right? Hobbes is featuring throughout this course, but rational calculations that limitations are reciprocal. That's this, right? That's like, okay, maybe I want to deal with you however I want to deal with you, right? Sort of maybe just arbitrarily, like whatever I feel like in the moment, and like I want that, maybe that's what I want. And maybe you want the same thing. You want to just be able to deal with me however you feel like at the moment, or whatever like you think gets you the most benefit at whatever particular time. Right? Maybe we both want to do that. But we don't really want each other, like I don't want you to treat me that way, and probably you don't want me to treat you that way. And so we have some sort of an agreement that, or some sort of recognition that, well, if I restrict the way that I deal with this person, and this person will restrict the way that they deal with me. And when I say restrict, I mean like they'll restrict themselves from doing some of the things that they know would be damaging to me, and I would, as I want you to do that, I'll also restrict the things that I know will be damaging to you. So that's this reciprocal, this reciprocation. Right? If I limit myself, you limit yourself too. And that's rational calculation, that's true. So identification with one another. It might not just be that self-interest. It might really be that you and me, we have some common values. We both value, I don't know, the educational process, or we both value sort of natural law concepts of the right to life, liberty, and property. We might just hold those things common. And it might not be as much about fear, or it might not be as much about rational calculation, just as like we really identify with one another, or with the values that we both hold. But, says Bull, like the idea of those common interests, those common values, you know, it might be vague, and it doesn't really tell us which behavior is acceptable and which is not. So if we both value, this is something that I do sometimes. I haven't taught it for a while, but I have in the past a few times taught like American politics. And you know, one of the things that we talk about there is the Constitution, right? And the sort of, well, we talk about like, sometimes we'll talk about like American political culture, and we'll say, okay, part of American political culture is something like freedom of speech, right? Which is protected in the Constitution, which is sort of a big part of American political life. We have this idea of freedom of speech, and you and I both value the freedom of speech, I would guess, right? The chances are that's true of you as it is of me. But the fun thing to do is when you're teaching that class is to give a bunch of different scenarios regarding freedom of speech and see, well, okay, we both value freedom of speech, but where do we draw the line? And when you start getting into the nitty-gritty of it, in terms of how to behave, you know, should we invite the Ku Klux Klan to come and talk to our elementary school students, right? Should we give them half an hour to speak to our elementary school students? Right? Usually people don't think that's a good idea, right? Which is fine, right? But then, you know, there's other like more difficult people that we might invite, not more difficult probably than the Ku Klux Klan, but there's more difficult in the sense that like there might be some people that I would invite that maybe you wouldn't invite, right? And so while we have this common value, that doesn't always tell us exactly how to behave in a particular situation. Not at least it doesn't always tell us the same thing to do. So then we have these rules, right? We have these rules. They might be in the form of laws. They might be in the form of morality, custom etiquette, right? When I talked about sort of you and I dealing with one another and sort of restraining the way we deal with each other, right? That we might talk about etiquette with that, right? There might be a certain way that we would speak to each other if we were having a conversation. You know, and that would sort of vary depending on how intimate we were, right? What our level of relationship was. And so, you know, hopefully we would all abide by those, right? And we mostly do. And certainly Hedley Bull thinks that we do. And there's also laws, right? There's things that are illegal for us to do to one another, or you know, things that might be considered immoral, but not necessarily illegal, or anyway, different types of rules, basically. It says order could be maintained without rules, but the rules are one way of maintaining it. Rules may be made by dominant elements, but other members of societies will still want what the rules bring. There's a common, I mean, you perhaps hear this in Marxism quite a lot, right? And I think Hedley Bull certainly talking sometimes to Marxists, disagreeing with them, right, but sort of addressing them. And you know, they might say, well, it's the more powerful in society that are setting the rules, and we all just have to obey by it, and it's in their interests. But Bull says, no, it's actually it's in our interest as well as it's in their interest, right? In terms of, you know, having a law against killing, which is maybe the more obvious one, right? Is, you know, that's for sure, right? That's in the interest of the elites, right? They don't want to be killed, but also you and me don't want to be killed either. So it sort of helps everyone. We still want the benefit of that rule. We want the results of that rule, even if we're not making the rule, and even if it looks like it's mostly in their interest, right? I don't know, theft, for example, right? There are people in the world, there are people in the United States that have a lot more to lose, right? If there was a lot of theft going on, people have a lot more to lose than I do. So maybe, you'd say, well, yeah, they're making that rule so you don't steal what they've got, so they can amass a big fortune, and then, fraud, laws against fraud and theft and robbery and all those things. It's to protect their wealth and the massive wealth. And I said, well, yeah, but I'm also sort of glad that the stuff that I have, which is, okay, it's not as much as them, but it's, at least I don't want to just take my stuff off me or defraud me of it in any way. And so we all benefit. We have these common interests. And I put common interests in brackets there, in parentheses there, because, we're talking still about international politics, even though it doesn't sound like we are. But we're talking about international politics. And, if you're a realist, one of the first things that Morgenthau says, and E.H. Carr, but we didn't read E.H. Carr, but they say, look, this idea of common interest, there's no such thing. But Bull thinks there is. He thinks there are common interests. Rules have to be effective. You won't get universal adherence to rules all of the time. They must at least be reckoned as a factor in calculations. I'm going to find myself talking about Russia again, right? And Ukraine, because it's the biggest thing that's happening right now. But it's a good example of this as well. Russia might not, right? They might choose to invade Ukraine, and that would be breaking a big rule, right? The rule is something like, external sovereignty. You don't invade other countries. You let them have the laws that they want. You let them make the choices. That's their internal affair, and you don't meddle with it, right? That's a rule of the international society. Now, as I'm saying that, I can think of times, right? We can all think of times where the United States, for example, hasn't honored that rule, right? And maybe there's exceptions to the rule, and you say, well, you can do it only under certain circumstances, and America only does it under certain circumstances, right? Perhaps. So maybe it's just not a hard and fast rule. But that's not really the point. The point that we're making is Russia might choose to invade Ukraine. And maybe every other country in the world will think that was not justified in doing it. And we'll say, and if we're tempted by the realists, we might say, see, look, it's every man for himself. It's a war of all against all. And there's no such thing as rules and international norms that don't stop states doing what's in their own interest. What Bull's saying here, though, is something. He's saying, let's say that happens. Let's say Russia does invade Ukraine. What Bull's saying to them is, he's saying, or what he's saying to the realists who are saying, see, it's all about state interest. He's saying, but look, they had to calculate. They had to calculate that they were breaking a rule. For sure, they broke the rule, but they knew they were breaking the rule, and they knew that there would be some consequences for that, and they factored that into the decision. So for sure, so yeah, maybe they're acting in their own interest, but part of what's in their own interest is to not undermine the international society, not undermine the shared rules and the shared norms that exist. And so, okay, they've done it, but they had to weigh that in the balance. And then rules are effective when you have institutions, and this is why. Institutions make the rules, they communicate the rules, they administer the rules, they interpret the rules. We've talked about this, I think, before when we talked about the EU. They enforce the rules, they legitimate the rules, they adapt the rule, and they're protected from changes in society, the rules. And I guess we're still talking about sort of civil society here. But of course, everything that we say about sort of relationships between you and me, we're also now with Bull going to say the same about relationships between states. If we think about institutions that govern your and my relationship, right? Well, I mean, for straight away, most obviously, there's the university. There's a code of practice for you as a student, and there's one for me as a faculty member, and they're different, but there's lots of rules in there. I hope you've read them all, right? I've read some of the rules for the faculty member, so I understand some of the things I can do and some of the things I can't do, some of the things that I have a responsibility to do. And those rules govern yours and my relationship in this context. Of course, if we go beyond the university, right, there's laws of you know, if we're in Arizona, both of us, or in the United States, right, there's laws about what we can and can't do. But there's also, like we said before, there's etiquette and things like that. But institutions, you know, there's the police force, there's courts, court systems. There's also in the university, right, there's panels of people who can, you know, if you or I have a complaint, right, we can go to them and they'll sort it out. They'll do these things, right? They'll administer the rules and interpret them and enforce them. They'll impose a penalty on one of us, perhaps, and they'll legitimate the rules, and they'll adapt them, right, for particular circumstances. And so now Hedley Bull goes more specifically into international relations. He says, okay, he says, there's this thing called the national interest. And this is the same idea, I think, as common interests that you and I might have. And he says, look, you know, there's such a thing as the national interest. And he says, okay, accepting that there's such a thing as the national interest doesn't tell us about what the actual interests of states are, or how those are perceived or pursued by policymakers. Why is that important? It's important because we might say, well, we talk about the national interest, but the policymakers, they're not rational actors, or they're not clever enough to act in the national interest. They're acting in their own interest, in their own singular interests, and away from the national interest. Or there might be disagreement between, like, well, what does Russia really want out of Ukraine? Does it just want to increase its security, or does it want to threaten Central Europe, right, and further enhance its prestige and perhaps its economic and position in the world? You know, those two things might be both related, but, you know, in terms of what the interest is, we might not really be able to tell. And in terms of is Putin really acting in Russia's interest by doing what he's doing? You know, we can also disagree about that. But he thinks that there is such a thing as national interest, and whether we know what it is or not, whether we know how to carry it out or not, it tells us two things. One, that there is some sort of coherent interest. States are not just reacting to events; they have some interest, and that it's a national interest. It's an interest of a nation rather than sectional interests being pursued. So whatever Putin's doing, well, if he's acting in the national interest, right? The fact that we can talk about national interest suggests that there maybe is some concept that we have that we can talk about that unites everybody in a nation. States may have different objectives, but all agree on the importance of maintaining elementary goals of social life. And here are the rules. This is sort of the evolution of rules from an operational rule. This is the way we do things to an established practice. This is the way we have always done things, right? So this is what we should carry on doing, to a legal convention. And so once you know, if you think of international affairs and think of something like diplomacy, right? There's all these rules about diplomacy now. So think of diplomatic immunity, right? That's one of the rules. And yeah, it just used to start off. That's one thing that started off as something that just states did, right? They didn't prosecute foreign diplomats, right? And so as that went on in time, nobody prosecuting them, then that became an established practice, and now nobody expects that to happen. Nobody expects foreign diplomats to be prosecuted, and so then they just write that down, right? And it becomes a legal convention. They write it down and say, okay, well, you can't do that because we have never done that. And then there are these three complexes of rules that play a part in the maintenance of world order. One is the identification of world politics of the era as a society of states. There's the rules of coexistence. And then there's the regulation of cooperation. So how our question at the beginning of this was like, how is world order maintained? How is order maintained in world politics? One is we recognize that world politics is taking place in this era. We recognize that there is a society of states that governs it. And so because of that, right, there's some certain principles that we agree on. And so we have these, all based on these rules of coexistence. that are limiting war, and encouraging the recognition of sovereignty. And then also we, rather than just avoid sort of conflict, we also want to, the rules also regulate cooperation. And so the institutions then, how do they work? Well, institutions are made up of the sovereign states that make up society. So the members, it's not individuals, it's not particular princes, right? Or as it might have been in the old days, it's made up of sovereign states. It's the states that are making the rules. That's one of the more important aspects of this, right? Institutions make rules, but because it's the state, the institutions are the states. And we talked about this in the last lecture when we give those two different examples of what the EU might be. Because it's the states making the rules. Right? They're governing themselves as a community. States communicate the rules through official statements and their actions. Right, so it's one thing to say this is the way, this is the rule, right? What's one of the rules that they might say? Don't tolerate terrorists within our borders or something like that. So that's one way of, that's one rule. And then actually hunting down and prosecuting and arresting and dealing harshly with terrorism shows. Yeah, that's the, through official statements and through their actions. So states both communicate rules through official statements and through their actions. Maybe there's no accompanying statement. Maybe we just watch the states and see what they do. And if you're doing the same as they're doing, then you're sort of keeping the rules, right? If you're another state. The thing is here, whether the states administer the rules themselves or through the international organizations, that sort of doesn't matter. That doesn't change the fact that we have an international society, right? As long as it's the states that are doing it and not the institutions separately from the states, right? One example of this is the, what is it? It's like, I'm thinking of like some of the interventions that the United States has made in Iraq, in Libya recently, and in Kosovo. I think I'm right in saying that Kosovo, the NATO action in Kosovo, right, which was to sort of administer the rules, right, to say something like, look, the Serbs, this was the claim. Right, the Serbs, you're ethnically cleansing, or you're attacking this population of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo, you're treating them differently. That's against the rules of international society, so you should stop. All right, so maybe there was an attempt, I'm trying to remember the exact details, and I don't think there was a NATO resolution that allowed them to go into there, but some things are, sometimes those are not so clear anyway. Of course, the second Iraq war, there was some states that said, no, you have to get a second resolution to go into Iraq, and the United States tried to get a second resolution, but when they didn't, they just went in anyway. So, but what Bull's saying is like, it doesn't really matter, right? Whether the states are doing it sort of outside of the UN or inside the UN, it's still the states are doing it. The only reason it would matter is if the UN was independent of states, was separate, and the UN was sort of forcing the states to well, if it was the UN that was administering it rather than the states that are members of the UN. States, because they're the ones who are administering it, they're also the ones who are interpreting it. They're the ones that interpret the rules. There's no arbiter. There's nobody outside of the states. They agree with the realists. There's no there's no power above the states. But they are the ones who are interpreting the rules, and they also are enforcing the rules. Which might make it uncertain, right? Because maybe one time they'll do it one way and one time they'll do it a different way, right? There's no consistency, perhaps, right? But it's because states are enforcing it. States legitimate the rules, states adapt the rules to suit particular circumstances, and they protect the rules, right? So in terms of institutions, it's not institutions that are doing it, it's states, but states might use institutions to do it, and that's it. That's where we're going to finish this lecture on the English school, again, sort of summarizing the main points of the English school are this. There's an international society, number one. It's based on principles, shared principles and agreements. Those principles might vary from one international society to another, from one period of time to another. They change. But the important thing is that it's international society, that there's more than one nation state and sovereign states, or at least sovereign entities, right? And that they are interacting and that they are themselves the final arbiter. They're the ones who administer, interpret, enforce, make the rules. And you know, that's the way that they keep international order. That's the way that they, you know, in particular, sort of preserve life, property, and all those things that seem like common interests that everybody would have. States are doing that, states are managing that, states are enforcing that. And, you know, whether they're doing a good job or a bad job, they are doing it.